message from Amgen Australia.
Tim Lane, good afternoon.
Good day, Tom.
Well, I mean, as I said, I grew up going to Tasmania 3 or 4 times a year, and I remember it as being a very strong football state. I would like to think that the 500,000 or 600,000 people who live in Tassie could justify having their own AFL team. Peter Gutwein, the Tasmanian Premier, has put an ultimatum of sorts to the AFL. Do you think it's finally going to happen, Tim?
Well, I'll be fascinated to see what the AFL comes up with. Premier Gutwein says that he is expecting and would be very disappointed if he doesn't have a response today. And I mean, the AFL are in a corner here because they're ultimately responsible. They've taken responsibility for the management of the game in every state. It wasn't always so, but that is the way of it in these days of nationalisation. And the game in Tasmania is in an appalling state, and it's only going to get worse unless Tasmania is involved. I mean, you're either in the AFL or you're not. It's a juggernaut, and it steamrolls everything in its path, and that's not its fault. That speaks of its success. But Tasmania hasn't been allowed to be part of that success, and in fact has had to, pay millions of dollars a year to get a glimpse of AFL football in the flesh. And it's not as though all Tasmanians barrack for or are going to switch over to Hawthorn or North Melbourne. No, it's like a suburb of Melbourne in a way. People have their teams. Yeah. And the only thing that's going to really incentivate them, to use an old political word, is, beyond the teams that they have, is to have a team of their own. And, it's high time, and it's pretty much now or never. And I'm thrilled that the Premier has taken that position. He's forcing the AFL's hand.
Now, if you had a choice, would you relocate, like possibly a North Melbourne or indeed a Hawthorn, as Jeff Kendall has suggested, or would you, build a new team from the ground up?
I think you've got to build a new team from the ground up, and that's what I was saying a moment ago, that because Tasmanians have such strong loyalty to existing clubs, many of them, amid this discussion, ask themselves and seriously question whether they would switch. They can't see themselves, for example, barracking against Collingwood or against Carlton in our sake, Tom, and there are still Carlton supporters in Tasmania, and so on. And so the only way that it can be done, because, I mean, even if it was Hawthorn, with all the success they've had in recent years, people won't switch, and certainly in southern Tasmania, because they feel it would be a northern Tasmanian takeover if it came to that. So it's just not the way to do it. The AFL, of course, thrive on outcomes that are convenient, and so they would love to pull off a convenient outcome and probably have North Melbourne, that solve North Melbourne's problems and solve their own problem with Tasmania, but it's not the way to do it.
No, although I used to know a director of the North Melbourne Footy Club 10, 15 years ago, and he said that they were, North Melbourne was quite likely to have been the Gold Coast Suns, as in to be transplanted to the Gold Coast, but of course James Brayshaw, as the president, said no, and that was that. What about the north-south divide in Tassie? I mean, as you say, you stick a team in Hobart and the people up north get upset, you stick a team in Launceston and the reverse happens. Is there a way around that?
Look, I don't believe it's an issue. I've said often on this, amid this discussion, that a Tasmanian team in the AFL would be the most unifying experience the state of Tasmania would ever have. It would bring people together. The games would have to be played at each end of the island. There might be a bit of a skirmish over where the team was actually located, but in the end, sanity would prevail on that. It would need to be in the capital city. The AFL Players Association would be entitled to, push its hand on that. But once the team existed and the games were shared around, I don't think there'd be a fight. There would actually be unification. It would actually, and the AFL, loves patting itself on the back for being a social leader and so on, and doing things that advance life in Australia. Well, in the state of Tasmania, a football team would have an immense unifying effect.
Sure.
And that would be something the AFL, should bear in mind, because they might one day pat themselves on the back over what they've achieved in Tassie if they're prepared to do it.
Yeah, because of course, there's plenty of teams. I mean, our team, Carlton, play some games at the MCG and some games at Marvel Stadium. They both be home games. It just all depends on the opponent and the crowd and so forth. So the idea that a team could play home games at more than one ground is already well established. Do you fear for the future of Tasmanian footy in general if the league doesn't put a team down there?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was a kid, the competitions down there were thriving, the three major leagues, and Tasmania had wins against Western Australia and South Australia at the old National Carnival.
Yeah, I remember those, yeah.
That's how Tasmanian football was travelling at that time. But it's just, I mean, it's not even a pale imitation these days, because the guts is ripped out of it constantly by the draft, which institutionalises the taking away of Tasmania's best before they've even played in Tassie. Once upon a time we saw Baldock for 5 or 6 years. We saw Hudson for 3 or 4 years. But then things changed, and Royce Hart came to Melbourne without playing senior football in Tasmania. Likewise, Brent Croswell and John Greening a couple of years later. And it's gone on from there. And so the local competitions now have no real attraction. The other thing that's changed massively is that until the early 90s, live coverage of VFL and later AFL football wasn't allowed in Tasmania against the gate of local competition.
Ah, right.
But that was all let go in the early 90s with the formation of the AFL and satellite television and so on. It was impossible to enforce anymore. So now you've got what are relatively third-rate Tasmanian competitions against the juggernaut of the AFL. So who's going to go to the local footy? And the crowds now are measured in hundreds, not 3, 4, 5,000.
And finally, Tim, let's just say a Tassie Devils or a Tassie Tigers team does get up. Would you abandon the Mighty Blues and support them instead?
Well, look, it would be a major crisis for me, Tom. And this is a case I've argued long and to some boringly for many years now. But so I have a commitment to the cause, and it certainly would reshape my thinking of it. I would really want this team to do well, and if possible, I might wait.
If you're over 50 and